Welcome, everyone. I'm very excited to be here with Steve Hawley, editor of Spoon River Poetry Review. Thank you so much, people coming out. People are still trickling in. As always, any questions that you have, you can type it into the chat and I will work it into the conversation with Steve. And Steve mentioned he's getting over a bit of a cold, so he might be a little nasally, but welcome, Steve. Thanks so much for coming out.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So let's jump right in. Tell us, your journal was started in 1976, which is like eons in Lit Mag years.
Yes. Yeah, so it's a
Um,
long-running journal. It's coming up on 50 years. The founder is David Pichaski, who founded it as an independent journal in Illinois, out near Peoria, where the actual Spoon River is. So that's where it gets its name from. And then he edited the journal for 10 years. And then Lucia Cordell-Getzy, who is a faculty at Illinois State, began her stint as editor in 1986 and, sort of brought the journal to ISU. It was one of the founding publications for our publications unit, which I direct. And that was founded in 1991 to provide editorial, production, design, marketing, and distribution support for literary and scholarly publications, including journals and book presses. And so SRPR has been a part of the publications unit and at ISU since '86. So it's a founding journal for both of those organizations. And then Lucia edited the journal for 20 years, which is an astronomical achievement. So she edited from '86 to 2006. Then Bruce Guernsey edited from 2007 to 2010. And then my predecessor, Kirsten Hotelling-Zona, edited the journal from 2010 until this summer in 2023 when I took over.
okay, sorry about that.
No, no problem.
So when did you come on board and how did you get involved with the journal? I think sometimes people are looking to
Sure.
get involved in literary magazines and they don't know how. So tell us about your process getting involved with the magazine.
Sure. So I've been involved with SRPR now for 15 years. So I came to Illinois State originally to do a PhD in English studies with an emphasis in creative writing. And I got an appointment to the publications unit as a PhD student. And SRPR was one of the journals that I worked on. So I got familiar with the production side. And then pretty early on in the process, Bruce Guernsey and the associate editor asked me to become a manuscript reader. So I started that, I believe, in 2009. And I was a manuscript reader. I was also a graduate assistant that worked directly for Kirsten while she was an editor in 2010 to 2011. And then I just stayed active in the journal. And Kirsten asked me to be the poetry editor, and kind of like took that out of her role as editor in chief about 5 or 6 years ago. And it was at that time that we started having, conversations, legacy conversations as far as like editing the journal. And the idea was for me to take over when she retired from ISU, which she did in the springtime. And she also stepped down as editor of the journal, shortly after that in the summer. So we had a legacy and succession plan. So I've had a long stint with the journal, done just about everything that you can do for the journal, as far as the editorial side, selecting the poetry, managing the editorial team and the manuscript readers, and then also on the production side.
Okay,
So
great.
I feel like I've been in almost every position on the ship, so to speak. So I'm ready to be at the helm.
That's great. So can you just tell us brass tacks, what is your publishing schedule? When are you open for submissions? How many poems should a writer submit at one time? Do you only publish poetry? Just sort of cover the basics, if you will.
Sure. Well, our reading period is open from September 15th to February 15th. And that's our open reading period. And you can find out information about that at srpr.org. Right now we use Submission Manager, but I believe we're going to be transitioning to using Submittable soon, probably for the next reading cycle. The other big way that people submit and subscribe to the journal is through our Editor's Prize. So we have a $1,000 Editor's Prize contest that opens January 1st and has a deadline of April 15th. For our open submissions period that runs from mid-September to mid-February, we usually get packets of 3 to 5 poems from each submitter with a cover letter that sort of like situates where you've published before, like the kinds of publications that you've had, and then also, matches up the poems that you submit, with the what's listed in the cover letter.
Mm-hmm.
And then for the editor's prize contest, the submission, has a fee for it, but it includes a year's subscription. And for those, we get up to 3 poems, and it's an individual poem that's judged by a guest judge for the contest. And, we have 3 with contact information, and then a set of blind copies that we pass along to the guest judge to select, during the spring and early summer. And that awards $1,000 to the top poem from that year, and then also $100 for 2 runners-up. And then we also name several honorable mentions who get their entry money back for submitting to the contest. And we usually do 6 to 8 honorable mentions, depending on how things go and what's already been snatched up by other publications by the time we get to it.
Sure. That's great. So does the magazine publish print and online? Are you guys still publishing print issues?
We're still print centric. We're looking to move our review content from print to online. So we've had a sizable review essay that covers 3 to 4 books of contemporary poetry tied together under some overarching theme that all the books share, or like some way that they're contributing to contemporary poetics. And we're looking to transition that or to have something else in the review space, and we're going to have that be primarily online. But yeah, the journal is still very like print focused, but over the coming years, we're going to look to diversify that a little bit. And I'm not exactly 100% certain of what that will look like, but we definitely have ideas that we're pursuing.
Sure. So we have a question here. It's kind of a big picture question, but I think it's an important one. What are some of the biggest challenges right now, but also generally, to taking the helm of such a long-running lit mag?
Well, I think like there's, like 2 big challenges. The first is practical, and that's money, like finding money to keep publishing the journal. Thankfully, the editor's prize contest is the biggest support system. So that's the way that most of the people who subscribe to the journal, that's how they subscribe. And that's also how the journal gets its operating revenue for the year. It's been difficult for SRPR, over the past decade or so to find and apply for grants, but we're definitely going to be doing more of that. And, like I feel my role as editor-in-chief is to take on a lot of the, less sexy tasks, such as like finding money, and then also, like building the reputation of the journal behind the scenes, making sure that people know that it exists and that it's awesome and it's been running for a long time. I'd say like that's the other big thing is just it's such a crowded field right now. So I always think about, the existential questions for a journal like SRPR. Why does it exist? What separates SRPR from other journals? Why do readers come to SRPR? Why do poets want to contribute to the journal? And I think if I can, have solid answers for those questions, it really helps to be able to talk to people about the journal. And coming in as editor, with respect to taking the helm of such a long running journal, the thing that is obviously the biggest draw is that we're poetry focused. There's not a lot of poetry only journals that are in our space. And so, I definitely want to be able to emphasize that. Also, like I'm really interested in building a public and building a community. And so I think that's a big part of editing a journal is doing the community building work. SRPR has always been a journal that's rooted in Illinois, but also has national and international reach. And I really want to take advantage of that. I'm very interested in poetry and translation, and I want to, emphasize and shine the light on that whenever the opportunity arises. But I also want to, get out there into the state. I want to do stuff that's community focused, beyond just coming up with what goes in the print pages of the journal, but getting out there and meeting with poets in Illinois and around the Midwest, and having opportunities to like get together and see who the poets are, to meet them face to face. So I'm planning to do that in the summers, to have some SRPR road shows where we have readings and open mics and meet and greets, in all different parts of the state, and especially downstate, because I think, a lot of attention gets drawn to the folks who are literary figures in Chicagoland, sometimes at the expense of the rest of the state. So I want to go and meet those poets.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned that you're switching from the submission manager to submittable. Can I ask why? Just, I'm purely curious, and I think it might help people to understand some of what goes on behind the scenes. I know submittable, yeah, so a lot of editors struggle with submittable, and I'm curious, and does this mean you're going to start charging a submission fee?
Yeah, we're looking at all those things. I mean, the main reason behind it is for a long time, Submission Manager has been able to feed data into a database system where we track submissions, both the regular submissions and then those from the editor's prize contest. And its capabilities for that have kind of like broken down, and we don't really have anyone on staff who's web savvy enough to make sure that that's always functioning for us. So that's a big part of the reason.
Becky too, she's named, and she's got.
Plus, I think like the inertia of submittable is so great at this point that it's something that you have to look at. I mean, the key difference between the two platforms, for Submission Manager, everyone has their own account with individual publications, and for submittable, you just have your submittable account and you kind of like manage everything through that. And being a user of both, I just find like submittable, even though I know that there's costs associated with it, is a much more smooth process for the user. And that's really what we want to emphasize, is being able to know that users are able to submit easily whenever they want without any kind of like back end breakdowns. And that makes a big difference for making sure that people are able to submit and engage with the journal, as their needs see fit.
Mm-hmm. And regarding the translation, which languages in translation are you particularly interested in or looking to see from international poets?
Well, I mean, for me, like I definitely am always looking for lesser translated languages, under-resourced languages and cultures. And what I mean by that is I think, countries that have a ministry of culture that are good at promoting, exporting their literature to other places. And I'm thinking, Spanish from Spain, French, German, they're all particularly well resourced. So I'm, interested in countries and languages that maybe don't have a ministry of culture that can, lean on US and other publishers to publish the work. So that's like kind of a vague answer, but I think you can, I'm really interested in, different kinds of languages that you wouldn't see in other translation or other like poetry or literary journals. So that's the very vague, the very vague kind of answer, but I think it's as specific as I can be. Other than that, I'm just, I'm interested in, just reading works in translation. There's so little that's still translated, even though I feel like poetry and translation has gone through a flowering over the past decade or so. There's just so little available and so much interesting work happening out there.
Yeah. How would you describe, so jumping to the content of the journal and what you publish, how would you describe the poems that Spoon River likes to publish, is seeking, sort of in terms of form, subject, focus, or would you say it varies, issue to issue?
Well, I'd say like over the past couple decades, SRPR has really been known for having, interesting juxtapositions, like poems that you might not expect residing in the same journal being together. And that's something that I'm still very interested in. Like the arrangement strategy for the journal is something that I'm really interested in. How are we putting like poems and poets in dialogue with one another? So I don't know that I like necessarily have a type, but similar to my answer with the poetry in translation question, I'm definitely interested in poems that other journals, keep rejecting for whatever reason. So, I'm interested in folks, sending along their like overlooked lost dog kind of poems, if that makes sense.
Sure.
And I mean, sometimes poems get rejected for a reason and things like that, but sometimes those are the poems that are, on the edge of the envelope, so to speak, for what is, can be thought of by folks as poetry. And I'm definitely interested in that. I like poetry that's going to surprise, or challenge, or even, like cause some discomfort for me, as opposed to, the so-called like well-wrought urn, where it's something that's familiar, or perhaps comforting. Like I tend to go for something surprising, or even, something that will make me feel a little bit uncomfortable, or that I'll have to wrestle with.
That's interesting. So do you mean, can you say more about that? Like, so do you mean that something in terms of the subject matter, or in terms of the style, like it's a little more experimental than you're used to? And sort of relatedly, like what kind of experience are you hoping to have from a poem? Do you like to have more of like a kind of cerebral challenge, or an emotional, disruption of some sort, or all of the above?
I think it's all of the above. I definitely like, like poems that are formally rigorous, or, what you might call innovative. But also, it doesn't always have to happen through that, like, I really like the Emily Dickinson cliche, the top of the head blown off, to like really feel, that kind of like visceral reaction to a piece. And I've had the opportunity in being poetry editor to get, like that poem that's the like capital it poem. I'm like, this poem is just right for this issue of the journal. Also, like, it's saying something that I feel like is important, or, it's like, sometimes you get a piece that acts like it's like a clarion call, or a trumpet thing that will just set the tone for the issue. And I'm always looking for that. I feel like if you can have that in every piece, or in every issue that you publish, it can be really important, and it can just kind of like galvanize the issue.
Sure.
So again, it's not a very like specific thing. I guess it's kind of like a, it when you see it. But I think of certain kinds of pieces that have come in over the years, like Steve Bradbury's translations of Amang, who's a Taiwanese poet. Like her poetry just was like the right thing to start off an issue. Or there were translations of Selva Casal's poems by Janine Marie Pitas. The same kind of a thing. Like that was a poem where, I think it was about like the desire to just like, kiss strangers, but it's sort of like in a political kind of way, where like, like we're being galvanized through that thing. And that kind of like speaks to all the things that I want to do with the journal, emphasizing poetry, building community, publishing poems from, lesser known cultures in the US or languages. And then also like, leaving a legacy, like having a journal where people will want to, seek out back issues because of a particular poem. And it, when I do get emails about things like that, it really makes me happy to be the editor, when folks are like, my grandmother bought me a subscription to SRPR when I was in high school, and this one particular poem, I can't even remember what the title is, but can you help me track this down? Like when I get emails like that, it really is a cool part of the job.
That's great.
It's something that I want to do. Like I want, someone to seek out an issue of SRPR from, the time that I've been working on the poetry, when I've been the editor, and they're like, this poem was important to me at such and such phase of my life, and I really want to seek that out, or I become a fan of this poet or this translator because I first encountered them in SRPR.
And I see there are questions here. I'll get to them in one second, but just a related question. You mentioned that you like to have the work communicating with other work in the journal. So I'm curious about your editorial process. Do you reject work that you really love, but that just doesn't speak with the defining tone of a particular issue? Or do you just accept all work across the board that fits, and then try to piece it together afterward?
Definitely the latter. Like we accept all the work that we feel fits the journal, or that speaks to members of the editorial team in a particular moment, and then try to create the best issue we can, by putting those parts into conversation with one another. And like while I'm the editor, we also have two associate editors, Holmes Trollstrip and Jenna Goldsmith, and they're responsible for the bulk of the poetry and how it gets arranged. So they're coming up with those strategies to make the work communicate, or to have interesting juxtapositions and things like that.
Really cool. And so you mentioned also that it's you're interested in the work that's been rejected. Should a writer mention in their cover letter, these poems have been rejected 80 times? Perhaps they're perfect for you. Is that will that make a difference?
I mean, it could make a difference. Yeah, I mean, if that's something that I say that I want, I guess like in the cover letter, pointing that out doesn't hurt.
Okay, great. So a question here, any plans to put more archive content online?
I would say so. The only issue with that is the people power to be able to do that. So I know we have a good bit of digital content from issues since at least like 2010 that are linked online. So a lot of the review essays, definitely like parts of the SRPR Illinois Poet feature, and then at least a handful of poems from each issue you can find as linked PDFs, when we have a new issue launch and put that on the website. But yeah, I think, being able to have access to, past issues of the journal is important. So we would like to find a way to do that. I know like revamping the website is high on my priority list for unsexy tasks that an editor-in-chief must do. And I hope that the archival content comes along with that we're able to do both things.
Great. And we have kind of a long question. So actually, Andrea, why don't you go ahead and unmute yourself? Because I think this question will be better with you articulating it.
Okay, thank you. I'm wondering what the best way is to characterize self-published work when talking about it in a cover letter. So you said you want us to say, where we've been published before, or, a history of our work. So as an editorial board, do you distinguish between indie, hybrid, self-published, and self-published by the author herself, going into some platform and just doing it, versus self-published with the expertise of a designer and a book-length work versus a chapbook? So you can tell from the question I'm one of these authors, and I'm wondering how best to tell you when I send you 3 to 5 poems and I write my cover letter, what my long history with poetry is.
Sure. Well, I come from a very like DIY indie spirit background, so I definitely have a lot of value for that space in publishing, but I realized that across the board it's not always the case. So a lot of the perhaps like guesswork that you have to do as a poet submitting to a journal is is this the kind of hoity-toity journal that's going to look down its nose at folks who have self-published before. And I know that myself as an editor, I'm not one that's likely to do that. I want to have all submissions and be able to have the editorial team go through them and figure out what's best for the journal at any particular time. And if that's from a writer who has been self-published throughout their career, or who kind of like mixes and matches self-publishing with work in the traditional space, I think that's fine for SRPR. Like I would welcome that. And like that's where my spirit lies. I guess like anybody that's editing now, if you're not a good like indie spirit scrounger DIY kind of person, like I don't think that you're going to make it, because we SRPR is definitely not a journal that has even though we have some university affiliation, it's definitely not a true money affiliation. So we don't have like a giant war chest or anything like that. So we definitely are in that indie SRPR against all the other journals kind of spirit, or maybe not like that. I don't look at journal publishing as a competitive thing. but I definitely like feel that we're in that space and in that spirit. So I hope that is a helpful answer. That's a tricky,
Thank you very
question. Much. And I think I see what I see where it comes from.
Yeah. So how many submissions do you get per reading period? And can you tell us what you tend to see a lot of in submissions? I know from my own experience now that I'm reading actively more lit mags, with the poetry, I see a lot of falling leaves. Like that's just like falling leaves seems to be like a metaphor that comes up again and again and again, which is great. It's lovely. But I'm curious, like if there's something that you can tell us, I see this metaphor a lot, and you got to do it, fresh. You got to make it fresh if you're gonna work with it.
I mean, we get several hundred submissions per month, so a sizable amount to go through. I mean, I guess, like what I have grown weary of over the years is the name of the journal, Spoon River Poetry Review, which, as I mentioned, is tied to the actual river in Illinois and not Edgar Lee Masters' Spoon River Anthology. So I think like sharing a name with the Spoon River Anthology, I think signals to folks to send a certain type of poem, like something that might be, like appreciation of nature, or something that like is in the vein of what, Edgar Lee Masters, sort of like character vignettes are from Spoon River Anthology. If I could, tamp down the number of those kinds of poems, I wouldn't be upset. But otherwise, like there's, everybody's at different places in their poetry writing life when they submit work. And, I can respect that. I mean, you have to try, and submit something. And I feel like so often when you're submitting work, you're engaging in a relationship with a journal. And, the first time that you submit, maybe the work is absolutely not something that the editorial team is looking for, but, like that's just like your first engagement with the journal. And, like hopefully over time you like read the journal, like you grow and change as a poet yourself, and you try again. And especially if it's a journal that you really want to publish your work, and hopefully there's instances where, you can get feedback either in the moment or by stopping by like the SRPR table at AWP to just have a conversation about poetry. And, so, and all that stuff does make a difference, like putting faces with the submissions is something that's really important, especially when there's hundreds and hundreds of things coming in. It's hard to keep in mind when you have to make, quick defensible decisions about what to publish and what to not publish. Like sometimes, those kinds of interactions or relationships that submitters and contributors build with a journal over time, can make a big difference.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What are you seeing? Are you seeing trends, either stylistic trends or subject matter trends in terms of what people are writing about? I always think editors are sort of in this great kind of privileged position because they can see like what's on people's minds at a given moment. So I'm just curious if you're seeing, like now everybody's sending in poems about, the weather or their pets or anything like that, or if it's just totally, kind of random.
I mean, you definitely over the past few years, there's been a lot of COVID or post-COVID poems or isolation, alienation type of poems. Like those kinds of things I would say have been a trend. And like everything else, sometimes that it's handled in a very like interesting and insightful way, and sometimes it's just like, oh, another one of these poems, and that kind of thing. I would say that's the biggest thing. Otherwise, I feel like there's not like a dominant aesthetic or trend that's really motivating things. I think you see, I don't know, like that's probably like the biggest thing that I've noticed over the past few years is just that like type of poem. Mm-hmm. But I feel like, maybe when we were in like the blog era of poetry, there was sort of like very clearly defined, aesthetics that would come in and out of favor. But I haven't really like felt that over the past like 3 to 5 years. Maybe we're in some kind of like poetically like transitional space. Or I've just gotten like so far down the poetry and translation wormhole that I kind of like see the translation as being one of the like trends that I'm interested in, or what like folks from how are folks from other cultures writing? What does that mean for U.S. poetry? And maybe like wrestling with how those two things relate to one another is what I'm interested in looking at.
Sure. Are there any restrictions on form, or is it all fair game?
Pretty much everything's fair game. I'd say like we have the biggest conversations as an editorial team about like prose forms that are like lyric essay, like how lyric does it need to be prose poetry versus like I want to say like just an essay, but you know what I mean, like what is like expository prose versus like lyric essay. And I think the journal is open to lyrical prose or prose poetry, but I don't know, like it's a boundary that I think we're still like trying to wrestle with.
That's really interesting. So do you guys have like a hard and fast rule about it, or is this something that's ever evolving? Like, where is that line between a flash fiction piece, a very short piece of flash fiction, and a prose poem?
Yeah, I mean, I guess like the baseline for it is just experience over the years with the way that poets write prose, if that makes sense. Like it's definitely like tricky to define, but I feel like there is like a boundary between something that's a creative nonfiction piece and a lyrical essay. And I think like lyrical essays are really, if you want to talk about trends, I think that's something that's really popular or is like very of the moment, that a lot of people who write both poetry and prose are writing lyrical essays. But I do think that it's for a poetry journal, and we're kept at 128 pages per issue. So when we think about like anything that would be like lyrical essay or long form prose poetry, or however you want to construe it, like thinking about what that is, how much space it will take up in the journal, is definitely like a question that we cover. But we don't really have any like formal restrictions. We do look at things that come in, our journals, it's 5.5 by 8.5 trim size. So it's sometimes not great for long line pieces or, like pieces that use the whole space. And we have to get creative sometimes with how we do production work for those. So sometimes like practical stuff like that comes into play. But yeah, we're pretty formally open, like we're interested in all different kinds of things.
Sure. And can you tell us some common reasons for rejection?
You know, it's hard to say. I mean, I guess it's just I guess like the tricky thing about rejection is like a lot of times it's a manuscript reader has X amount of time to deal with the poem, and you don't know like what the manuscript reader is going to be thinking or feeling on a particular day, and they have to make like the best decision based on their evaluation of that piece, like in a particular time. Whenever I'm training somebody, I always talk about the halts principle, which I have for myself. If I'm hungry, angry, lonely, tired, or sad, I will halt from doing work where I'm having to make those kinds of decisions until I can, get into a headspace where none of those things apply. And, sometimes that just doesn't happen. And I often say, like, when I'm talking to people who are getting started with their literary career and are just starting to send out work, that the work that you send out, it might get rejected by a manuscript reader or an editor one day, and if they had seen it 3 days later, they might have said yes. And you can't really control that. So I would say like in terms of what gets rejected, it's really like hard to say. And it does come down to that particular reader or editor on that particular day having to make what they feel is the best decision for publication for the journal.
Yeah.
And I'm sure like I'm sure that we reject publishable pieces all the time. In fact, I know it because stuff that's in like gets withdrawn before we can get to it. So there is that little bit of competition that way where when people are simultaneously submitting. So, or like, things that get withdrawn are, things that I wouldn't necessarily have accepted for the journal. So it's definitely, there's no science to it as far as like rejections go.
Sure.
And I know it's hard to be rejected, but you really have to find a way to try to not take it personally as you possibly can, and just think about it as one step in your relationship with that particular publication. And the next thing that you send in might be the thing that they say yes to, and you have to maintain that belief.
So writers should keep trying the magazine. If they receive a form rejection, they should send work the next time it's ready. Is that right?
I think so. I mean, I guess like the way that I go about it in my own writing life, if I get rejected by a place, I'm not sending, shaking my fist and sending work tomorrow, I'll show you. But like maybe when I have, and hopefully everybody has this in their writing life, like you have a moment where that you're doing things on a level that you couldn't have before. Maybe it's like a particular piece, maybe it's like you've written a lot during a particular period of time, and that's made your writing change in some significant way. So like maybe when you reach that touchstone, or you've like let things sit a while, or you've like like read issues of the journal and maybe like figured out something about what the journal seems to value, and you have like poems that match up with that, like it's a combination of factors, I guess. But I definitely would say like if you try a journal one time, especially if they get hundreds of submissions per month, and they happen to reject your work once, and you say, well, that's it, I'll never get published by them, that's not the right attitude to have.
Sure. Yeah. So can you talk about your affiliation, or Spoon River's affiliation with the university, and maybe some of the pros and cons of having that kind of institutional relationship?
Oh, sure. So SRPR's particular situation is it's run by an independent 501c3 nonprofit called the Spoon River Poetry Association. And the editor is usually the president and chair of the board for that nonprofit. And then also has had that long affiliation with ISU. So since 1986. So that's nearly, what is that, nearly 40 years now of affiliation. And also the production work through the publications unit. There's 2 staff at the publications unit, and then a lot of pre-professional staff in the form of undergraduate interns in ISU's publishing studies sequence of the English major, and then also graduate students in creative writing. So they're getting hands-on experience in producing the journal. So there is that mutually beneficial partnership that SRPR has with the Department of English and the publications unit, in that it can sort of like extend the masthead and have this production team that works on the journal. Also, like the space that the publications unit occupies. And in the past, Kirsten, the previous editor, was on faculty in the department, and that's been the space that previous editors have occupied. And it's been useful for them as well. They get to bring editorial work into their teaching practice. They get reassigned time for their editorial work. You can use the journal as a way to have really great events, like poetry events. So SRPR has a annual poetry event that's named in honor of Lucia Cordell-Getzi, our longtime editor emeriti for the journal, that happens in the spring. And it's co-hosted by SRPR and the Department of English, ISU and all that. So, like having that affiliation, the journal's been, like so ensconced in the department that it's difficult sometimes to like tell the differences. But I guess like the con of it, or the thing that's a sticking point, is there's definitely like students and folks that rely on having the journal available to get this pre-professional hands-on training in literary journal publishing, but there's not a lot of funding, true money funding from ISU for the journal, so it's kind of on its own as far as like raising funds. And I think that other journals have different situations in their university affiliation, but this is our situation that we have. And I don't know. I mean, I wish, that the university would be able to, be able to provide more for the journal. But at the same time, you know, like if I were able to do that, I would have snapped my fingers and made that happen already. But, you know, I want to make sure that the journal's in a place where it can continue to be a space for hands-on learning for folks that are going into publishing. But it also, you know, like the journal needs to be able to, you know, survive and thrive, you know, as it heads into its 50th year and beyond. And so figuring out how to make that happen is, a big part of my job. So
sort of the ongoing challenge with all
yes.
literary magazines. Yeah.
Yes.
So a question here, just going back to rejections, do you send both form rejections as well as personal ones?
I would say the majority are form rejections, unfortunately, but we do every now and again send personal positive ones or send, you know, suggestions or notes of encouragement. So if you do get a personal positive one, that should be, you know, a big sign to you to keep developing your relationship with the journal, to continue to submit. But even if you get a form rejection, it doesn't mean, you know, that a reader or an editor, you know, wasn't moved by a poem. You know, like people have to make really difficult decisions. We definitely train folks on the editorial team to be selective about what you know, gets moved forward in the process after submission.
Mm-hmm.
And so like I said, you know, don't let rejections be discouraging. I know that they are. No one likes to get rejected, but you know, you have to keep trying.
Yeah, sure. And you mentioned earlier that sort of one of your jobs as editor is to sort of distinguish the magazine in terms of its identity. I don't like using the word brand, but sort of its, you know, its ethos, its artistic values, its identity. So I'm curious if you have a clear idea of that. If you could talk a little bit about that, it may help people who are trying to figure out if their work is appropriate for the magazine. Like, how do you see Spoon River as distinct from other poetry magazines?
Sure. Well, you know, you use the icky B word, but I actually like the challenge of building a brand. You know, a lot of what I talked about before with that whole, I'm always like thinking about the existential question, like, why does SRPR need to exist? If it needs to exist, you know, like what are the things that make it unique? And, you know, the issue that is in production right now will be the first one, you know, with me as editor. So I do have a letter from the editor in there. And I do, you know, think that the pillars of the brand, so to speak, are poetry, that we're a poetry first journal, community, that I really want to be building a community through the journal in whatever ways we can, whether it's through, you know, digital launch readings for the issue, which will start soon, through offsites that we set up at AWP, being able to use our table for folks who have been published in SRPR that are coming out with chapbooks or books, but maybe their publisher is not able to go to AWP, like using our table for signings and things like that. And then also, you know, like I said, thinking about legacy. You know, it's a journal that's nearly 50 years old, which is not easy to do. You know, what is our legacy from that first almost 50 years, and what do we want the legacy to be going forward? And like I said, I want it to be, you know, a journal where it is publishing poetry that, you know, is having an effect on people, you know, something that, you know, they're seeing, you know, later on and valuing, or maybe they don't value it in the moment. So maybe it's sort of like a very like teacherly way of building legacy, where, you know, like you can't compel people to like poetry at first blush, but somehow poetry does this little thing where it like wedges itself in your consciousness and you know it later on. And, you know, like, and that's something that I don't have a blueprint for how to do that, but I know that it's important, and it's why the journal has persisted for this long. So, you know, those are my three things: focusing on poetry, building community, and then having a journal that, you know, has a legacy to be proud of.
Mm-hmm. Do you think aesthetically, are there similar pillars, or is it sort of just anything goes? Are there like preferences in terms of narrative poetry or political poetry, personal, you know, accessible, experimental, or is it like you just want to see everything?
I mean, I definitely, you know, I definitely would say that I have a bent toward poetry that has, you know, that's in that space I hate to use the term like all poetry is political, but I do like stuff that has a little bit of a political consciousness to it. And I'm not saying that every poem has to be like some grandiose political rant. I do tend to like poetry that has a documentary background. I'm very interested in that, like poetry that's using source materials, or that's interested in, like some kind of thing that's happened. I don't want to spoil this, but the poem that won the most recent Editor's Prize, 13 Ways of Looking at a Dead Fish by Marissa Davis, talks about the recent train derailment, like the toxic train derailment in Palestine. Is that Kentucky? Ohio, that contaminated the river. And it brought me back to like Muriel Rukeyser's book US1, like Mark Nowak's Coal Mountain Elementary. Like it's definitely a poem that's in that space, and I do like works like that. But I also do like a lot of like strange stuff. I also run a press called Cohen Press, and the aesthetic that I have for that, which mainly publishes poetry books, is something that I call the visceral mystical, which is a thing that I sort of like coined to talk about like strange poems that use, let's say, like the unpleasant insistences and discomforts of the body to like get towards some higher level thing, like the uncanny, the sublime, or some kind of like enlightenment through those things. Like you pass through, the body's whatever the body does, to let you know that it's there all the time, like getting sick, which I'm just getting over. But like, does that lead to something that's, on like a higher level, or does it like grant some kind of like wisdom through the poetry? And if I had to like pin down, like kind of aesthetic that I go for, that would probably be it, or some kind of fusion of those two things that have like a little bit of a political consciousness or a documentary root, but that also, are very like aware of embodiedness, and use that to get to something that's, just beyond the telling of what awful things the body has done to you this time, so to speak.
That's interesting, because those things are so different, like the mystical and then also the sort of source-based documented. It's interesting. And it also, what you said made me think of, do you know Rattles news of the week prompts, where writers write poems in response to a news event? I'm just curious if you're familiar with that, and if that's sort of in keeping with the kind of stuff that you're interested in.
I mean, I'm definitely interested in that kind of thing. I'm in the I would be more interested in the news that stays news kind of poetry, not necessarily just a flat response to current events. But I think Marissa Davis's poem that'll be coming out in 48.2, that's a poem that I would be interested in. 10 years from now, 15 years from now, it's interesting poetically, but it's talking about a very specific thing from current events. And so, I definitely, like those things compel me. And there's also, like a documentary component to it, but it's also like lyrically exciting. So.
Sure. And here's a kind of bigger question. I don't want to keep you here all day, but should we be worried about a wave of AI generated poetry? Any thoughts on AI and how it's kind of entering our creative sphere?
Well, I mean, there's been, computer generated poetry has been around since at least when I was in MFA school, which is 2004 to 2006, because I talked about it in my MFA program, and people were not pleased that I was talking about it. But I think, whenever you come across computer generated poetry, or now like AI chatbots that are, going through these massive, concordances of text, or, I think we've seen a lot of poets and writers whose works have been used by Meta or other companies without their permission to try to figure out like, what's different, like how can those machines learn, or how can those neural networks learn what is fiction and what is poetry versus the rest of what writing is. I think whenever these moments come up, it just, like pushes poets and people who are appreciating and reading poetry to figure out what the human element is for poetry. Like what can a person do that a machine just can't?
Right.
And, like with a neural network that's simulating a human neural network, I'm sure that it's going to get closer to, being humanistic types of things generated through AI than ever before. But I still have confidence that there's something, like a certain something that you can do in poetry, that, for lack of a better term, is magic. And I don't look at AI as being able to do that kind of magic yet. So maybe it's like a naive belief from me, but there's always, if there's not like a humanistic thing that is compelling you through the arts, I think like just, more clearly like honing what that thing is or describing like what that humanistic thing is what will come out of AI generated poetry.
Yeah, I think that's very true. A question, do you publish found poetry in the vein of documentary poetry? And if so, do you also publish the writer's commentary along with the poem?
I mean, we don't generally publish commentary unless it's, footnotes or something paratextual that is, needed for the poem to make sense, or to contextualize. But yes, we definitely, publish found poetry in all its various styles. So I mean, I guess that's the best way to answer that question.
Yes. Yes, you do. And so what is on the horizon for the magazine? When is your next issue coming out? It sounds like you have a submission period open now. What can readers and writers look forward to?
Sure. Well, we are going through a light visual rebrand, so a little bit of a different look. We also have a chapbook series called Spoonfuls that we've launched in the past couple years. So our next issue is set to appear in December. It's just about to go to the printer. That's issue 48.2. It will have some of the new visual look and feel to it. And then our Spoonfuls chapbooks will come out in April. So we're excited about those. And we're looking in the future to be able to open up Spoonfuls to submissions, perhaps in a contest style. And, we really want to do that for the books that are going to appear in April 2025. So just building up those two things, more digital content, especially in the form of like reviews and things that we've received for reviews. Another thing that's on the horizon is we're partnering with the Poetry for All podcast. I'm not sure if anyone's familiar with that. But we're going to be doing like a print version of some of the work that they do on the Poetry for All podcast, which is like it does like close readings of particular poems, both those contemporary and some well-known poems from the past. So that'll start to appear in issue 49.1, and that will kind of be replacing the review essay in the journal. So I think that that's an exciting thing that's on the horizon. Yeah. And the folks that do Poetry for All, Abner and Joanne, they're really brilliant folks. So I'm excited to be partnering with them. Yeah. And it also, puts SRPR, in a different space to have that kind of collaboration.
Do you have any things? Yeah. Do you have any openings for volunteers? If somebody hears this, they're excited about the magazine, they want to get involved in some way as volunteer readers or anything like that?
Yeah, so I'm definitely in the process of building out the editorial team. We definitely are looking for manuscript readers. If you're interested in being a manuscript reader, you can contact me. I'll put my email in the chat. And then we also have other positions to move on from if you're wanting to take on a more significant role with the journal. So we're building out a team of contributing editors, and then we also have advisory editors, and all of them are working together, to come up with what the content is for SRPR. And like I said, transitioning to the editor-in-chief role, I'm actually doing less with poetry than ever before for the journal, which is strange to say, but that's the reality. So the associate editors, are really in charge of the poetry. The main thing that I'll be still editing is the SRPR Illinois Feature Poet, which is a poet pairing, both of whom have some connection to Illinois. one person's poetry gets featured in issue 1, and then the other partner in the pairing interviews that person about their poetry and contemporary poetics. And then in issue 2, the roles reverse. So the other person's poetry gets featured and the interview shifts.
Okay, great. One final question, and then we'll let you go rest. So this is a question I ask all editors. What keeps you going? What keeps you motivated? I think it's a particularly difficult time for lit mags. A lot of them are struggling. So what keeps you personally invested in this work?
Well, I mean, the struggle keeps me invested. Because there's a struggle, it means there's something we're struggling for. And I really, believe in poetry and poetry-only journals, the value of it, the possibility of getting more people interested in poetry and excited about poetry. One of my mentors in my MFA program was Anne Waldman, and one of the pieces that she's done as far as interviews and expository writing that is the most of interest to me is called Vow to Poetry. And she talks about how she, made a vow, to this, rebellious art. And I kind of feel the same way for me. So most of the decisions I've made in life are about how to get as close to poetry, both with my own writing and then also with editing and publishing and promoting other people's writing. And so, that vow and the fact that poetry's never lost interest or been something that, has ever gone away. There's definitely like ebbs and flows in terms of productivity, but like poetry's always been there ever since I first started getting interested in it, which is when I was very young with like rhyming books and books of verse for children, through learning about Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson in high school and starting to write my own like terrible poetry at that time, all the way up through now. I've never there's always something like more to learn, always something that is inspiring and challenging in engaging with poetry. And those two things keep me going. Like the struggle itself keeps me going because the value for me, has been great. So I just want to be able to deliver that to other people as well.
That's great. It's beautiful. Well, thank you so much for taking the time today. And thank you everyone for coming out. This was really great.